Hi guys, I'm back to read Polaris again. We are quickly getting through this book now. We don't have much left. Let's find out what happens after they've gone back up. Chapter 23, Dark Days. As the crew mulled over its failure for the next few days, the weather seemed to be trying to lift their spirits. The skies were blue and there was a steady wind out of the southeast, but no amount of tropical sunshine could brighten their moods now. Their thoughts had turned stormy, and their prospects of survival had turned dark. They did what they could to improve their situation. They boarded up the hatches again. They fortified the door to the cabin in case they needed one last refuge to retreat to. "It won't matter, you know," Henry had said as he held out another nail for Owen to hammer it in. "Once a creature is full strength, with 6 barbed legs and each as strong as a kicking mule, it will tear through wood like a sparrow flying through a spider web. It is only a matter of time, and not much of it either." Owen mumbled, "It might matter," and then promptly smashed his thumb with a hammer. Ouch. As the sun rose and fell, and the shadows stretched and retreated, the crew jumped at a very sudden sound. On a ship whose wooden seal constantly groaned and thumped, their nerves stretched thinner and thinner, and their hardships didn't end there. They cut the rations in half, but by more or less general agreement. The food they had would have to last now, unless maybe they could pull some from the sea. And at the first hint of rain, every bucket and pan they had was set up to catch the fresh water. Now they were hungry as well as sore. The enormous task of sailing the ship alone has made harder still by the grumbling stomach aches and the lack of energy. The little cleaning and maintenance they'd kept up with was abandoned. If they ever did get to Polaris into port, she wouldn't be a pretty sight. Neither would her crew. And a quick rain shower swept across the sea on the third day after the failed hunt. The crew scrambled to collect the water, but not one of them made a move to grab a bit of soap in long overdue cleaning. Their hair grew matted and clumped, their faces were streaked with greasy, and their clothes, which had been grimy from some time, already descended into indecency. "What is that smell?" asked Aaron during a brief lull in the wind. Thatcher looked up from where he sat, sharpening his hatchet. "It is us," he said, waving the blade around in a menacing circle. "It is all of us." The wind had picked up again after that, mercifully scattering the odor. But the wind gained strength, and its mercy was short-lived. Soon the ragged crew had to scramble up the rigging to take in more sail before something else on the neglected ship broke or tore. Once again, Henry had barely reached the top the time the others were descending to the next sail. Owen balanced against the forward topsail yard, grabbing canvas in fistfuls, and considering the frail boy, it wasn't a lack of experience at this point. It was a lack of aptitude. Henry simply would never be an accomplished sailor. What bothered Owen most about it was knowing that apart from some wounded pride, Henry didn't care one bit. Owen saw the way the other boy's eyes searched the horizon for land. He wanted nothing more than to be back on solid ground, likely for the rest of his life. Owen longed to reach port too, of course. That was the only path to survival. But the sea and the ship was his home. His uncle had taken him in after his mother's death and his father's descent into sorrow. And the bottle, the Polaris, had given him a place and a purpose. He would return to shore, but not to stay. He looked forward to reaching safe harbor for a time. There would be men and guns there, and the army perhaps, whatever it took to wipe their foul cargo from the face of the earth. And afterwards there would be a heap of strong lye soap to scrub its memory from the sturdy old wood of the Polaris. Who would take over the ship, then? Who could say? But Owen felt sure his family would have some say in that matter. And whoever it was, surely they would need a steady cabin boy who knew the boat inside and out. So yes, he would bring the Polaris into port, but it had to be a safe one. It had to be in the United States, where the laws of property and inheritance would be respected and upheld. Unfortunately, even with kind winds, the U.S. was still far beyond the horizon. They were still sailing across the blue waters of the Caribbean Sea, and not everyone shared his conviction to see the journey through. The talk had started up again as soon as they had returned from their ill-fated trip between decks. "We must steer for the nearest port," said Thatcher. "Those who meet us may not be of our nationality, but at least they will be of our species." It was and he was far from alone in the position. In fact, as the days wore on, it was Owen who began to feel more and more isolated. The idea of an organized watches fell by the wayside. The pumping took up more and more time, and still the ship rode lower and lower in the water. There was simply too much work to do for the few of them to do it. No one worked harder than Owen, but having been on deck for much of the night and all the day, he pulled the captain's spare pocket watch from his trousers, and noting the passing of another 4 hours, his watch was at least technically over. With his sails in good shape and no need to adjust the sheet or stay, he finally sunk back into the cabin for a few hours of sleep. He took one last look over the helm. Can I trust the others to stay course? He yawned. He would have to. The light was dim, and he entered, and the air was thick with the smell of his crewmates. Even though none of them were currently here, he wanted nothing more than to stumble over to the hammock and let the sea rock him to sleep. But then he forced himself to the desk first. He wanted to double-check their heading one more time. They could not afford to waste time correcting their route later. He turned up the lantern above the desk and took a seat. As soon as he was off his feet, his body seemed to collapse. His eyes drifted close, and his head dropped down. Owen snapped back awake. He forced his eyes to open wide and shook the sleep-fogged head. Check the course first, he told himself, then sleep. He had to dig hard into his memory for the observations he'd taken on the deck just a minute earlier. He reached for the map blindly. As he looked over through the big compass, floating level in its gimbal as its ship gently rose and fell, his hand searched the desk for the map, but he didn't feel it there. Strange. He let his hand hop around on either side. Ow, he yelped, feeling a sharp jab in his palm. Turned his eyes from the compass towards the desk. He had stabbed himself on a V-shaped device known as a divider. What is this doing here? He mumbled to himself, and then he saw the map, pushed halfway up the desk and folded over in entirely the wrong way. He sprang to his feet and raced toward the door, fog of sleep burning off under the sudden searing heat of anger. Someone has been fooling with all the navigation equipment. Owen fumed at the thought. He had forbidden it. They had all agreed. Marks had been made on the map, pins and clips affixed to exactly the right spots, and now, just by him, but also by the captain himself, and those dividers had been opened to exactly the right width to check the next measurement against the last. 3 words burned in his brain, and then he barreled through the door. Who did this? The door slammed hard against the wall. Owen looked the entire scene at glance. Thatcher was leaning in close to Aaron and just past the quarterdeck. At the sound of the door, they both wheeled around and looked straight at him. Their eyes were wide, but he didn't think it was fear he saw there. It was something else. And when they both looked down, avoiding his gaze, he knew what. Guilt. They'd been caught talking behind his back, and it was a common enough occurrence aboard a sailing ship where the gossip and slander abound, and no one was ever too far from anyone else. He was sure they were talking about him. He headed straight towards them. Thatcher's eyes rose sheepishly, but they didn't meet his. Instead, they lingered on the gun stuck in his belt. What is it? Said Maria from over the wheel. Her voice was innocent enough without being too innocent, and he made up his mind then that she was not a part of it. He reached the edge of the little quarterdeck, but he did not descend the steps. Instead, he stood there glaring down at the other two. Who's been at the maps? He snarled. They're a mess, a wreck. I think we've lost some of the markings. He stared daggers at them as they said it, trying to make them understand the seriousness of the situation. Navigation was a complex business, relying not just on compass readings and star settings, but also on map and intuition. Owen had poured every bit of his brain into it and had nearly gone cross-eyed staring at the maps and charts. He had swum upstream against the wizardry of the Bowditch practical navigation, and if he felt he had made some headway, if he had gained some confidence that they were on the right course, it was just barely, and now to have his work upended, and for what? Where are the others, he demanded a moment later. Then he saw Emma aloft, of course, and Henry bungling Lord knows what task on the forecast. He turned his attention back to Thatcher and Aaron. Sure, it was one of them. He spat to the next words and positioned the pellets. Who did this? Thatcher finally looked up. He was glancing eye contact with Owen and broke into a small, maddening smile. Perhaps it was Daffy, he said. The ship's cat, spurted Owen. Why not, said Thatcher. She can't go below to catch rats anymore. Maybe she got restless and made a mess of the desk. Owen glared at him. Aye, maybe she did jump up there, he said. But tell me then, when did she learn to use the divider? Thatcher looked down. She's an exceedingly clever cat, he said to his own sun-browned bare feet. Owen heard a soft chuckle from Aaron and felt his face growing hot and his pulse pounding in his ears. But tell me, said Thatcher continued, not having seen the map, I don't know for sure, but are we not nearing some large ports? Owen felt his head was going to explode. So that's what this is about, he muttered bitterly. Thatcher had pored over the maps, trying to find the nearest ports. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut. Owen desperately wanted to leap down and throttle Thatcher into unconsciousness, and then wake him up by tossing him overboard. Perhaps just a bit north of here, added Aaron. Owen glared at him, his eyes narrowed in slits. You too, Aaron? Me too what? Said Aaron, his voice dripping with fake innocence. Owen shook his head and looked up to the sky. It was useless. He saw the pale gray sails stretched tight with wind and Emma moving high up through the rigging like a spider. He could prove nothing, and who would he prove it to? There was no greater authority left, no captain to order the chained up below, no first mate to whip their backs raw. There was just him, and he was so tired now. He felt his pounding pulse soften and the blood draining from his head and his shoulders slumped. And what punishment could he possibly threaten that was greater than what they had already faced? By hand or claw or sea, they would all be punished. Punished for deeds of others, punished for forces beyond their control. It didn't seem fair. He looked at Thatcher once more, sizing him up. He noticed that he was now wearing a hatchet in the same place that Owen himself wore his gun. Punished for the deeds of others, he thought again. But maybe we will have committed some crimes of our own by then. All right, and I'm going to try to read chapter 24 because it's quick. Chapter 24, Uneasy at the Wheel. That night, Owen was standing at the wheel. The moon was nearly full and the sky was cloudless. The deck glowed silver all around him. He looked at the sails, shimmering in all the moonlight. They'd be prettier with more wind in them. He thought the wind had dropped off and the heavy ship was making slow progress through the night. Once again, he tried to calculate how much longer the voyage would take. They were nearing Cuba now. If he had figured it correctly, he knew 3 things about the island. It was ruled by Spain, produced a tremendous amount of sugarcane, and was quite close to the tip of Florida. It was the target. That was their target. If they had the time and the crew, they would bring the ship back to the teeming ports of New York or Boston. But they had neither, so Florida would have to do. He ran through what he knew of the place, too. It was a U.S. territory now. Some said it would become a state soon, but others said that day was still a long way off. They had been troubled in Florida recently, fighting between the army and the native population. But there were ports there and deep harbors. The closest was Key West. If they could skirt the western edge of Cuba, they could turn east and head straight there. His hands light on the wheel, his eyes drifted over the aft hatch, still boarded up tight as a drum. They just needed a little more time. He looked at the drooping sails. A little more time and a little more wind. A thought occurred to him. They could go back on full rations tomorrow. They were close enough, and he was reasonably sure there was enough food left. With the ship going so slowly, they had even managed to catch a few fat fish. Maybe more food would ease the tensions and quiet some of the conspiratorial whispering. The only person he was sure was on his side was Henry. If Owen understood correctly, he wanted to bring the ship back to the United States out of some loyalty to his former employer. Owen wasn't sure exactly why, but he was glad for the support. Though he was an abysmal sailor, Henry enjoyed the certain status among the crew as leading authority on the creature lurking below. But Thatcher, agitated constantly for heading to port, and had moaned and groused at every one and passed by unseen from Kingston on the side to the Bazille town to the other. Aaron was quieter about it, but had made his alliance clear enough. Maria had too, though she had hardly blamed her for that. She was in constant pain now because of her infected foot, and welcomed the thought of a doctor of any nationality. Emma had yet to declare her loyalty. He hoped that she backed him, and was simply staying silent to avoid an argument with her sister. He thought Emma trusted him, maybe even admired him a little. He pictured her now, climbing nimbly up the shrouds. Owen tugged hard on the wheel, and if the ship had wandered off course, and not his thoughts. Focus, he told himself. It is the others I need to convince. Even if Emma was on the side, it would still be 3, 4, and 3 against. If she wasn't, the numbers would be against him. Regardless, he knew there would be a tremendous pressure to make landfall in Cuba once they sighted it. He'd have to make sure he was on the wheel then, or Henry. But then, they might crash into the shore anyway. And maybe it was the thought of the land so close, passing just off the starboard bow, or maybe it was a realization that most of the others disagreed with the course he'd set. Whatever the case, the troubling new thought sprang to his mind. It was a simple enough but utterly explosive to him. 4 words that were rarely entered before. What if I'm wrong? The thought was new to him, but the image they brought to mind was quite familiar. He whispered a name into the night air, and the name of an old sailor. It was the name he now realized for the first victim of the strange contagion that the Polaris now carried in its hold. Rickets. He remembered the changes that had come over him. The stammering gait, the creature's the perfume smell, and the grotesque rash. He shuddered to think that those were the changes would have led, and had they been left to turn their course. He remembered the mutineer's words through the door. Look at him. And the gunshot that had ordered to pitch the ravaged body overboard. They wanted to rid the ship of him, and to rid the world of the ship. They were the villains who had killed his beloved captain. But what if they were right? Wonder what is going to happen when we come back and read chapter 25. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow. Have a great weekend, everybody.